Thank you, Raymond. My best friend, or one of my best friends in childhood and in adolescence, was a guy named Billy. We went to the movies together. We played games, Risk and Monopoly and all that kind of thing. We played sports together. We went to church together. I really liked him. He was funny. And one of the reasons I liked him is that he was a little wilder than me. If he had a thought, he just would express it. I had to edit myself all the time, be careful. But if he had a thought, even a very inappropriate thought, he just blurted out. If he had a desire to succumb to a temptation, which he often had a desire to succumb to a temptation, he would talk about it openly and say, oh boy. And his greatest desire was that one day a girl would find him attractive enough to date and have a girlfriend. Well, when we were 13, remember how old we were. When we were 13, we graduated into the intermediate class in Sunday school. And our teacher was Jim Wayman. And one Sunday, Jim said, I'm going to give you some spiritual homework, is what he called it. I want all of you to go back to the Bible and find one promise from God. And I want you to claim it for your life. And then I want you to bring it back next Sunday and share it with the whole class. I chose Luke 12:32. The reason I chose it was short enough for me to memorize, and it was vague enough so that God didn't have to do anything concrete to prove that God was going to keep that promise. Fear not, little flock, it is your Father's good pleasure to give you the kingdom. So I recited that. Mr. Wayman gave me a thumbs up. That was a big deal, big deal. Thumbs up, good job. And then we went around, and then it was Billy's turn. Now, I would have bet my 10-speed bike that Billy Warren would have said, oh, I forgot, or I couldn't find my Bible, or I wrote the verse down, but my dog ate it. I thought he'd have one of a million excuses, but he was prepared. He stood up with his black leather Bible. He had the ribbon marked just perfectly. He said, the promise that I am claiming this morning is Isaiah 4:1. Mr. Wayman scratched his head. Thought, you know, Billy, I don't think I'm familiar with that. That's not one of the promises I know. Would you read it to us? Yeah, he was prepared. Yes, I would like to. And here's what he read. He said, in that day, 7 women will grab one man and cling to him by his garment and say, I will get my own food and I will find my own clothing. Just let me be called by your name. And then he closed his Bible. Mr. Wayman had to hide a smile. And then he said, Billy, I don't think you took this assignment seriously, but every other boy in that class knew he had taken it very seriously and found the one promise from God that he was going to claim, that one day 7 women would grab hold of him and beg him to make him their husband. The verse comes actually from a time of misery and sorrow in Israel, when war and famine had decreased the male population to such a state that there were lots of women who didn't have the protection or the connection in those days to a married spouse. And so they looked for a spouse anywhere, and they were willing to forego the normal expectations of a wife of her husband in order to get somebody to give them the name and the protection and the financial security of a marriage. Any eligible bachelor, if there were, or even married men in those days who didn't have too many wives, they would grab hold and say, please, let us be a part of your family. That kind of urgency is found in today's passage. But it's not people clamoring for a spouse, a husband or a wife. It's people who grab a hold of folks and cling to them and say, let me go with you because I know you know where the Spirit of the Lord is. What do you know that I don't know? You ever said that? It's one of those phrases we pose to people who have something we desire or admire. What do you know that I don't know? If you could go anywhere in the country, anywhere in the world, and pose that question to somebody, where would you go? Maybe you go see Warren Buffett, say, what do you know about investing that I don't know? How can you make me rich? Carol, there's a concert pianist, and I have a hard time with her name, but her name is Katya Bunyatishvili. It's not a household name. But Katya, at 25, was playing all the major concertos, all the Rachmaninoffs and all the Tchaikovskys and all the Beethovens. She learned all of them, mastered them, plays them beautifully. You can see her on YouTube all over the place. But at the same time, she learned to speak 5 languages fluently. I'd like to go to her and say, what do you know that I don't know about discipline and about concentration and about mental health? What do you know that I don't know? Maybe you'd like to go to Serena Williams and get some help with your backhand, or possibly you'd like to track down the Property Brothers and get some tips on how you can do some home remodeling. Maybe you'd like to go see Henry Louis Gates, my wife would. He's the guy on PBS that's always telling you about your ancestry and say, can you tell me more about where I came from and the people back in the day? Maybe you'd like to chill out with the Dalai Lama and learn a little bit about contentment. Where would you go if you could go anywhere and ask them, what do you know about this topic that I don't know? Well, in this passage from Zechariah, the prophet says, the people of God had been faithful to God, and they rebuilt the community of faith. You know, we've been looking at this for about 8 weeks. A lot of days we weren't sure they were going to do it. You know, they had a lot of problems. But when we get to this, the final sermon in this series, we find that the people in Jerusalem, they've done what God asked them to do. They've rebuilt the temple and they're worshiping there. They've reformed the court system and got all the bribes and the injustice out of the court system. They've begun to speak the truth to one another again, and they quit devising evil and harm to one another. They took care of the widow and the orphan and the poor and the immigrant. They put God back in the center of their community, and once again they began to shine forth in the whole world. Everybody began to talk about what had happened in Jerusalem. They had rebuilt the community of faith. They were loving and serving God. And so people all over the world began to say, what do you all know that we don't know? Zechariah says people in far-off nations, strong and mighty nations, will say to one another, come and go with me. I've heard they know the Lord in Jerusalem. I'm going to go myself. Why don't you come with me? And then when they get to Jerusalem, 10 people will grab a hold of one Jewish person and hang on for dear life and say, take me with you because I've heard you know the Lord. What a beautiful, glorious way to end this. It all happened. It all came true. They rebuilt it and they shined the light of God into the world. In the 12-step program, they talk about bringing the bottom up. I don't know if you've ever heard that expression, bringing the bottom up. And what they mean is that you force a loved one who has an addiction or alcoholism or many other things, you try to force them to hit rock bottom before they naturally hit rock bottom. You're trying to save them some of the pain of just completely bottoming out. So you do something to make them feel the consequences of their addiction before they have to hit rock bottom. One of the strategies is you may have to kick the person out of your house. And then they're out there on the streets or in a shelter and they're beginning to hit what life is like, and that might change them. That's the hope. Or you get a family and friends intervention and you face them down and you say, your behavior's hurting us, your behavior's hurting you, we're fearful of where you're going, we want to take you to treatment right now, the car's started, we got everything arranged, we want to force you to see this. Or they might scare them straight. You ever heard of that? Where they take folks to hospitals or jails, and they show you this is what happens when somebody doesn't stop drinking. You run into this. This is what happens when they don't get help with their addiction. You end up here. They may show them a documentary or force them to listen to a testimony of somebody, and they're all hoping that by bringing the bottom up, by forcing the loved one to see the consequences, they might scare them into recovery. Do you think it works? Hardly ever. Hardly ever. When I was a young man, back in the day, they taught us to do evangelism that way. You bring the bottom up. We were trained to go door to door or meet people in the street and say, if you were to die tonight, where would you spend eternity? Whoop, there's the bottom. Okay, what are you going to do? If you were to die tonight and had to go to heaven's gate, what would you tell the Lord to convince the Lord to let you into heaven? You bring the bottom up. You force them to look at their consequences of their actions. And we used to have revivals. You ever heard that word? We used to have these revivals, and you bring somebody in from out of town, and he always looked kind of like the front end of a Buick. His hair would go like this, and he'd wear flashy stuff, and he'd get up there and rock and roll. He was, have a lot of fiery things to say, and he'd try to scare you. He'd say, what happens if you die tonight? And he'd tell you a story about some elephant trampling a guy at the circus, and now what was that? What was you? You wouldn't be expecting that. Now would you be ready to go to God? What would you do? What would you do? And then sometimes on youth night they show you the worst, most horrible movies in the world about what happens when the rapture comes or Jesus returns and you're not ready or burn in hell, and they're bringing the bottom up. Do you follow what I'm saying? They're trying to get you to be frightened so much of punishment that you get down the aisle and get right with God. And it would often work for a while. When the invitation was given, everybody that could walk just about, I don't want to go there. How do I get out of this deal? But about 2 Sundays later, you wouldn't see them anymore. Because we learned that people who are scared of punishment don't necessarily love the Lord. In this passage today, we have such a more glorious way of evangelism. You create a loving community that cares for people, that welcomes people, that shows compassion and forgiveness, that worships the living Lord together, that loves to be together. And you create such a place that welcomes all people, and then the word gets out. And folks start saying, hey, you got to come with me. I've found a place where the Spirit of God is active. They may stop you at work and say, hey, what time's your service? How do I get there? Can I go with you? Can I sit by you? Yeah, come on with me. I'm going. You come too. Neighbors might call. Friends might stop you in the grocery store. You never know when the Spirit of the Lord gets active in a community of faith, when a community of faith is fully rebuilt and they shine out into the community. Folks want to be a part of that. They want to get close to that, and it brings them to the Lord. 20 years ago, I had a son living in San Francisco. And I went out to spend some time with him. And he was working for AmeriCorps, and he lived on the Presidio, and there wasn't a place for me to stay that I felt comfortable staying. And so I had a hotel, and on Saturday night he said, Dad, you want to go to church tomorrow? I said, yeah, let's go to church. He said, we'll be here at 9 o'clock. I said, well, what time does the service start? 11. I've never enjoyed the mornings, by the way. I said, why do I need to be? How far is it? Oh, it's just up the street. Why do I have to be here at 9 o'clock in the morning for an 11 o'clock service? She said, just be on time. So I got there, picked him up, and as we were leaving the house, his housemate yelled out, where are you guys going? And Micah said, we're going to church. And the guy goes, at Glide Memorial? And Micah said, yeah, that's where we're going. He said, you're too late. You won't get in. And he was right. When we got to the church, you couldn't get in on the ground floor. The ushers wouldn't let you in. And they said, well, there might be room in the balcony. And we climbed the 2 stories up to the balcony, and there the usher said, I can't let anybody else in. Fire code prevents it. People were just jammed in there. And then this family that was up against the wall standing, they said, I don't think our kids can stand here. All the service is too crowded. We're going to leave. You can have our place on the wall. And that's where we stood and washed and worshiped. And it was a very vibrant, as you might imagine, service. People of every walk of life. It was the strangest group of people other than you all that I've ever seen. The music was great. The preaching was good. The testimonies were powerful. And after it was over, I wanted to know, what do you know that I don't know? What does this church know about that I don't know? And so there was a woman with a big visitor button, and she was outside. And I went out there, and there was a long line of people coming from around the corner, going in the side entrance of the church to have lunch. They were homeless, and they were going to feed lunch there and provide places for them to sleep if they needed that. And I stopped this woman, and I said, why do you come to this church? And she said, because the Lord is in this place. She said, they welcome everybody here, red and yellow, black and white. Those were her exact words. She said, the rich and the poor, the gay and the straight, the well-educated, the street smart, the people who've been in church all their lives, and those who are nervous to be in the house of God for the first time. All these folks are welcomed and loved and taught and fed spiritually and fed physically if they need it. Everybody is welcome to hear the good news of Jesus Christ. I tell everybody I know about it, and that's why I'm here. And then she said, I got to go feed some soup to some people. I got to run. We have that here. We have that here. We're not fully rebuilt yet. We're working at it. We're trying to rebuild the community of faith, and we make little steps all the time. But right here, the Spirit of the Lord is here. And we have a dozen or more people in this church who had slipped into the depths of addiction and alcoholism. They found the Lord in one place or another, but they weren't sure where they would be welcome to worship, and they came here and found a church that welcomed them and loved them and gave them a place to serve the Lord, and they said, this is where I want to be. That word needs to get out. We need to tell people about that. Come here. If you got problems with that stuff, you're welcome here. We ought to get an amen by now. Okay, maybe next week. There are people here, over a dozen, I don't know how many, who've been through the pain of divorce just like me. And they felt broken, they felt ashamed, they felt angry, they felt confused, they felt rejected, or they felt, all sorts of stuff. And then the Lord kind of drew them back, and they thought, well, where can I worship? And some churches said, well, you can't serve here if you're divorced. You can't do this here if you're divorced. But this church said, come on in. We're going to love you. We're going to welcome you. We're going to care about you. We're going to help you rebuild your life. And they did. We did. And folks started, getting into happier relationships or finding the happiness of solitude. Some of you should say amen to that. This is a place where we welcome folks who are hurting and love them. And that word ought to get out. We ought to talk about that. You ought to say amen to that. There's people in this church that have gone through the loss of jobs, the loss of a house burned out, eviction notices, medical bills that overwhelmed them. They had babies they couldn't afford, had problems they couldn't pay for, and they came here and shared that need in this place, and this place responded. Helped them through the most difficult days of the crisis. We ought to let that be known. Everybody in this church has lost somebody, a child, the hardest loss, a parent, a sibling, a spouse, a significant other, a friend, and the mourning and the grief overwhelmed them. But this church stood with them and loved them and cared about them and prayed for them and walked with them until they could smile again, until they could remember that the future is still bright, until they could cherish that memory without being in the depths of misery. That's what this place did because the Spirit of the Lord is here. The whole world needs that. The whole world needs that. A place together and to be loved through our mourning, through our difficulty. The pews have been filled with people whose bodies have been broken by heart attack, been ravaged with cancer, suffered strokes, suffered viruses and other chronic illnesses, suffered what age does to us all. Can we at least get an amen to that? Do you know what I'm talking about? Yeah, I can look at you and tell you do. This is rough. And so here we are, and with medical problems and illnesses and worries about test results and how we're going to get through the treatment. And this is a place where people walked with them, helped them through, kept praying for them and standing with them and saying, you're going to be all right. And God is with you, and encouraging until they got through the treatment, till they got well, or till they learned how to manage the illness they have with dignity and strength. That's what goes on here. The world needs to know about that. We could spend the rest of the day with immigrants standing right here and telling us about how it was when they came to this country. They didn't know a single person. They didn't speak English. They didn't have a job. And they found their way to the church because they believed that Christ would have them be in church. And here they found people who loved them, who gave them job recommendations, who helped them get into school, helped buy them a car, get them into a home, stand with them, support them and love them and provide friendship to them until they were able to stand on their own. That is the Spirit of the living God who is in this place. And we ought to make that news known everywhere. God is here. God is working. And then there are so many folk who have come here through the years, maybe running from some other place, maybe broken by something, maybe lost by a million different things. And here they saw people who loved the Lord. They heard the gospel of Jesus Christ. They responded with faith. They were baptized. They were taught. They were loved. They were embraced. They were discipled. And they've grown into mature followers of Jesus Christ. Think of the students that have come through here through the years, that have connected, some of which still worship with us every Sunday all across the United States. The Spirit of the Lord is here. That's the greatest part of evangelism, that we may love one another, we may care for one another, we may show compassion to one another, we may give forgiveness, we may stand side by side. That is the Spirit of the Lord in this place. And God's grace is here. And the word's got to get out. That's what happened in Jerusalem. They rebuilt the whole community of faith, and it was so vibrant that the word went everywhere. It's not bragging, y'all, to say the Spirit of God is with you. Let me tell you that one more time. That's not bragging to say, I go to a church where God's grace is evident. That's bragging not on you or me. It's bragging on God. And that is called for. That's praise. That's praise. And if you've been helped in this church, whether you're here or you're watching online, there are people coming in here every day that need the same kind of help you received when you lost your loved one, when you lost your job, when you were new to the country, when you were caught in addictions. They come here every day. They need your word. They need your shoulder. They need your hand. They need your prayers. We got to rebuild the community of faith to be the shining light that God has called us to be, as we have been so often in the past. It will happen just as it happened in Jerusalem. It is happening here and will continue to happen. Chris Bianco's from the Bronx. That's where Carol's from. Chris Bianco's from the Bronx. And he says by his own admission that he failed at everything he ever did. Dropped out of school in the 11th grade. His dad kicked him out of the house when he quit school. He looked around to try to find a job here, there, elsewhere. He couldn't find a job. Finally, he got a job at a deli in the Bronx, and you know, the meat and cheese deli, and the proprietor taught him how to make mozzarella. You ever made mozzarella? Me neither. But it's a big deal. You got to stretch the cheese. You got to cook it. You got to aerate it. It's a long process. He learned how to make mozzarella. He tried some other things, but he wasn't very good at it. Finally, he was about to starve, and so he said, you know, if I got to live on the streets, I'd rather live where it's warm. So he got a way and a means to go to Phoenix, Arizona. And there, he didn't know what he was going to do, but he finally got a little odd job here. And he got a little apartment, had a little kitchen, and he started making mozzarella. That's all he knew what to do. He made mozzarella in that kitchen. He'd take it around to restaurants, and he'd say, I bet you this mozzarella is better than what you have. And most of them were buying institutional kind of processed stuff, and they would taste it and go, you're right, this is much better. I'll sell you the mozzarella. And he began to sell mozzarella. And finally some guy said, well, if you can make mozzarella, maybe you can make a whole pizza. He said, I can eat pizza. Maybe I can make one. And they put him back in the kitchen, and he figured out that the secret of good pizza, I always thought it was the sauce, didn't you? He says it's the crust. And he figured out how to make the crust out of the wheat that grew right there in the desert. And he made these pizzas, and he saved his money, and he was able to rent out a little storefront restaurant, and he fitted it with a wood-burning stove, and he started making his pizzas. He had no money to advertise. He didn't run a single advertisement anywhere. He didn't even have a sign on the restaurant for a long time because he couldn't afford one. But he made those pizzas, and people started coming to get those pizzas. And there was a New York food critic that made a big pronouncement that he was going to eat 1,000 pizzas in 1 year. And he was going to travel the world and eat pizzas everywhere, and then announce his top 10. And he did that, and a friend of his insisted that he go to Phoenix and eat Chris's pizza. And when it was all over, in the New York Times, he said the best pizza in the world is not in Italy, it's not in New York City, it's in Phoenix, Arizona, at Chris Bianca's Pizza Restaurant. Well, Chris has 2 restaurants now, but if you're thinking, you know, after this pastor finally shuts up, I may drive to Phoenix and get me a pizza, you can't get in, but maybe you can get a takeout. People from all over the world now learn how to make pizzas from Chris Bianca. Not because he advertised, not because he scared people, not because he promoted himself. He just made the best pizzas in the world, and people found him. I want us to make the best faith community in the world, the most loving, caring, compassionate, forgiving, welcoming place on the planet. And if we do that by the grace of God, we won't be able to keep people out of here. They're going to flood in. May God's grace lead us in such a way. Amen.